This morning, we have an exciting presentation on the Sadara Project, the power of alignment. Our speakers this morning are Joseph Brewer from the Dow Chemical Company, and Mr. Brewer is currently the Chief Implementation Officer for the Sadara Project, a joint venture giga project, so we've gone from mega to giga, with Saudi Aramco. It's really an exciting presentation. I got the privilege of seeing it before the conference, and I think you'll find it very fascinating. His co-presenter is Mark Triesch from EPM. He's the practice director for Major Capital Project. His 30 years of international consulting and industrial experience have provided a plethora of examples and techniques of achieving project team integration. Both these speakers, this project is just amazing. I've never seen a project this size, so I think you'll really find it fascinating. So please welcome Mark and Joseph.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody.
Joseph?
I'm sure when you heard that title, Chief Implementation Officer, you wondered where the heck that came from. And there's actually been quite a bit of good setup over the course of this conference about that word implementation. And that's exactly why that word is in that title. To put it simply, what you know, what you have available to you online, what you have on your shelf, what you have on your laptop, your smartphone, doesn't really matter if it doesn't hit the front line of what we do every day. And so 7 years ago when I joined this project, my job was to get everything that CII considers a best practice on the front line implemented on what has become the largest petchem project ever executed. So I'm presenting today with Mark Triesch. Why? Because Mark and I have actually worked together over the last 15 years on something that is absolutely paramount to success amongst all those best practices. This year marks 40 years for me in the industry. And I have learned one thing more than any other, and that is that achieving and maintaining alignment is the most powerful tool in your tool bag. And it's not just for successful projects, it certainly is, but it's the kind of powerful tool that you can export just about anywhere in your life. I raised 3 teenage daughters, and I use that word alignment a lot. You can use it in your community. You can use it in your church. You can use it wherever you go, whatever city council you sit on. If you can achieve alignment, you can achieve a lot of great things. There is a corollary to that, however, and that is, and I put it on a t-shirt, the hard stuff is easy, the soft stuff is hard. What do I mean by that? We engineers love to design things. We love to envision and innovate, but we put everything in an equation, in an isometric, in a foundation design. We pull cables, we have wireless signals running around. That's the hard stuff. And to be quite honest, it's the stuff we're really good at. The soft stuff is the people side, and we're not so good at that. We're not naturally gifted at those kinds of things. So the soft stuff is hard. And that's why we're in front of you today. We want to talk about that soft stuff that's hard to do. Let me move on to a story in my personal experience that started about 35 years ago and brought probably the first time washed over my brain the importance of alignment. And I use this picture. It's a picture of a 747. It's not an A380 because 35 years ago, this was the largest plane in the sky, commercially. And I was in a softball tournament. I played competitive softball, you know. Remember when we used to do that? I still carry a few of my injuries with me from those days. We were playing a round-robin tournament at the south end of Houston Intercontinental Airport's north-south runway. If you're familiar with that airport, you know which runway I'm talking about. There's only one that runs north-south. We were at the south end, and all day long, these jets were flying over. Now, in that days, they were DC-9, 727s, maybe the early 737s. It had been a long day. It was hot. It was July, August. It was this time of year, and we were definitely sweating, panting. Seventh inning, we're changing the field. I run out to the outfield, and about that time, a 747 starts to fly over. Now, it was noticeably slower than the rest of the planes that had been buzzing by all day long. But it was the first 747 of that day, and it certainly grabbed my attention. And I am not joking you when I say it was only about twice as high as this ceiling. It was lower than any of the other planes that had come by that day. And I could see every nut and bolt. The landing gear was retracting. I could see up inside the cavity. I could see the people's faces through the window. It was that close. And it hit me like a rock. Now that is agreement. When you can get 500 tons to hang over my head, maybe 100 yards over me, going in slow motion, that is agreement. And what was working over me at that time was how many meetings did it take to get all that agreement? How many emails did it take? Did they even use facilitated alignment session those days? I don't have any idea. But that was a manifestation and a very good example, a great metaphor for what agreement can achieve. An agreement amongst any team always allows and empowers that team to achieve its objectives. There is an opposite side of that coin. We've certainly seen it in your career. I've seen it in mine. When teams do not achieve alignment, there's some pretty bad disasters that can occur in our industry. And I'm talking the engineering and construction industry. It can also create havoc in my industry, in the chemical production industry. Alignment amongst our teams is paramount, but it's that soft stuff, and it's hard. At this time, we're going to give you some examples from Sadara. Yes, it's a giga project. It's very large. We're going to give you a sense and a taste and orient you on the size and scope of Sadara. But I don't want you to be too distracted by it. It is a backdrop to our theme that alignment's the most powerful tool in your tool bag. Let's run that video.
Our world is one of constant change and transformation, of energy and matter changing form. Our ability to harness these natural processes has shaped our lives. From the products we use to the medicines we rely on, we depend on hydrocarbons and chemistry for almost everything we do. Manufacturers use complex petrochemicals in countless ways. And now, Saudi Arabia's ability to create them is entering a new phase, opening up a world of new opportunities for the kingdom and its people. Sadara. Saudi Aramco and the Dow Chemical Company have combined their expertise to create a massive $20 billion petrochemical complex. Sadara has 26 integrated manufacturing plants, 14 of which are the first of their kind in the region. Set to produce over 3 million tons of chemicals per year, the facility is designed to maximize value from every hydrocarbon molecule processed. Using cutting-edge technologies, Sadara is introducing new products and raw materials to Saudi Arabia. Products which will enable the growth of new industries and provide manufacturers with the locally sourced materials they need. Helping to keep value in the kingdom and fostering economic expansion through science and technological innovation. Strategically placed in Jubail, close to local feedstock and export terminals, Sadara is spawning an entirely new industrial park, generating thousands of high-value jobs and helping to diversify the kingdom's economy. In a rapidly changing and competitive world, Sadara is turning potential into reality, helping to transform lives by creating value through chemistry.
So that's a little bit about the company. I'm going to give you a little bit more detail about the project. And again, I want to repeat, don't be distracted by the giga size, because our message is not about Sadara, it's about alignment. Alignment was a critical success factor for Sadara, no question. Largest petrochemical project ever built at one time. We like to say that a lot, just to remind ourselves of the challenge. But we were spread across 25 engineering offices during design, procurement. We had over 100 contractors on the site. Our site staffing peaked at 60,000 workers. By the way, that was short of what we wanted and probably needed. We achieved a 0.033 recordable incident rate on about 470 million construction hours. We're going to talk about that number. It's not a typo, and I'm sure there's someone in the room, and I'll be glad to talk to you later, that thinks that there was chronic underreporting going on to achieve that kind of number, but that's not the case. This is what we look like from space. I often joke this will be the first project I can show my grandchildren by taking them to Google Earth. 6 square kilometers is the construction site, the production units, all 26 production units, a lot of infrastructure. We started with raw desert. What you see on the left part of the screen is the laydown area. That was a good piece of news. It was close, and it was equal size, if not a little bigger than our construction zone. Here's the 25 offices. Our 27 project teams were spread across. It brings up challenges of how do you communicate? We heard from the virtual team yesterday. We had a lot of virtual teamwork. And just sending out emails falls pretty short in an organization this spread across, where you're trying to maintain a lot of harmonization, a lot of synchronization. This is about as simple as I could draw our organization. It's what it looked like during that design phase. 27 project teams, that's the vertical lines. 7 project directorates, that's the term we use. So we sometimes call them envelopes. Up to 17 support functions in sort of a classic matrix. We called it a 4D organization because there are certain things and capabilities and needs that you have when you go to this scale that you don't typically have to deal with when you're just a large project, or for that matter, just a mega project. And so we had woven into what you see on the screen a number of chartered teams around what we called our D3 capabilities, our needed D3 capabilities, things like the Office of Intervention. Concentrate the buy, but don't hurt yourself. We had about 12 of these D3 capability teams that helped us manage our giga size to stay on pace and apply all those best practices. Our fourth dimension was simply a recognition that at this scale, and you'll see on the next slide, spread over the kind of schedule we had, quite lengthy, that we were going to be faced with a transitioning organization almost constantly. We would always be having teams transitioning from feed into design, from design into construction, from construction, and it was constant, what we use the term morphing. We learned what morphing maps were. That's one of those things that you never typically have to deal with on a large project. However, we're not here today to talk a lot about this organization, other than to say your organization plan has to be a part of your alignment plan. Knowing who has what roles and responsibilities and the accountabilities that you design into the organization are absolutely vital to any alignment plan. This is the schedule, some lengthy feasibility studies to prime the pump, but with the start of feed and construction at this fall, we're at 99.6% complete. I'm demobbing most of my teams right now. 7 years. Quite a long project, if you call it a project. We call it a program because it's really a family of projects, all trying to be executed as in synchronization as fast as they can. A little bit about our products. Not going to go into detail about the flow sheet or anything like that, but you heard it in the video. It's really the first time in the Middle East that naphtha is being cracked for petrochemical production. And that naphtha cracking gives us a lot of streams off of that cracker that we can do things that have never been done in the Middle East before. 14 of these units, 14 of these products are first time for the Middle East. It is strategic to Saudi Arabia. And if I might add, I think there's a case to be made, and I'd love to tell the story of why I believe Sadara is part of that peace industry Dr. Bernard Amadei talked about last night. It's a great story. But just about everything that you touch today will contain the products that are made by Sadara. So this is a tremendously empowering production unit for Saudi Arabia, the region, and for the investors. I'm going to go through the 7 directorates very closely, show you some pictures of what it looks like, just to give you a sense. I've put the number, total install cost. This does not include feed. It does not include finance costs, so don't try to benchmark it with these numbers. It gives you an order of magnitude and the number of teams that we had against each one of these directorates. Olefins, the cracker, small aromatics unit, and the 4 polyethylene trains. Chemicals 1 is chlorine production. We produced isocyanates. It needs chlorine as an intermediate, and so we had brine production, chloralkali, and a unique technology on recycling chlorine with a HCl to chlorine unit. Isocyanates, the only location on Earth where all of the precursor molecules are manufactured all in one place, a very large unit. We have ethylene oxide, propylene oxide, and derivatives, a very large unit as well, 4 project teams. The infrastructure side is large. My rule of thumb when I'm talking to commercial guys on mega and very large investments where you start with nothing is the rule of thumb is probably 40% of your investment will be all that other stuff that you don't think you need, infrastructure. And site development and logistics had our tank farms, they had our off-plot piping, quite a large set of scope on-site tank farms for feedstock and products. Utilities, power, and infrastructure was the rest of the infrastructure, the utilities, pipe racks, et cetera, power plant, power distribution. And last is our envelope we call leveraged assets. This is the business systems, the manufacturing and operations, IT systems. It included automation, synchronization, as well as process analytical, sort of all that technology that tended to get into everybody else's business. We pooled it into a directorate we call leveraged assets. My last picture slide. Brendan Bechtel said something yesterday with his number slide that is absolutely correct, and that is giga projects and mega projects have a chronic problem of overrunning budgets by not a little bit, by a lot. Overrunning schedules, not by a little bit, but a lot. I'll take the risk of quoting Ed Murrow of IPA. He's benchmarking us right at this time, and he said, I'm benchmarking 7 other giga projects at this time, and the average cost overrun on those other 7 is 100% overrun. Well, Sadara has beat those odds. We've stayed within the tunnel. We've been performing pretty well against our objectives. And we've done that because we have worked really hard on converting CII best practices into the minimum requirement of walking into the door on something like Sadara. And so I'm going to turn it over to Mark, who's going to talk to us about those best practices and why that soft stuff is hard.
Thank you, Joseph. Thanks. So for the better part of a decade, I've been involved with Sadara and the people on it. And I do want to say that even though I've had that length of time of exposure, I still find the job pretty impressive. So when I see videos like that and hear Joseph speak, it's hard for me not to stay impressed. But as Joseph said, and I want to bring us there now, let's look at the CII best practices, the 17 best practices. So Sadara's objective was to thoughtfully address all 17 of these best practices. And they knew that we couldn't leave anything to chance. And minimum mandatory, we had to go in and look at each practice and say, what are we doing about that? Are we thoroughly addressing that? So what we decided is that just sets you up for success, but it doesn't actually guarantee it. And we were going to have to do a few things to take it a step further. Your project, you should know, your project is never so unique that you should be able to just skip over some of these things and say, those don't apply here. And I do want to say that Sadara actually tried that early on, that they thought because of our scale, because of our complexity, because of these experts we have, these things don't necessarily apply to us. And when Joseph arrived on the job, he said, oh yes, they do. And let's go after those in a meaningful way. So today, we're going to focus on just a few of these because we're talking about alignment. We're going to pursue those practices that where human factors like communication and trust matter the most. The soft stuff is hard. So without success in these practices, the others typically underperform. Alignment is the not-so-secret ingredient that empowers the rest of those practices to perform for us and to deliver the value. So as Joseph said, do the fundamentals well, and that really seems almost too obvious to be taken seriously. Many project leaders focus primarily on that hard stuff, as he said, and it's important to understand that all of those depend on the soft stuff. So an inherent challenge in our industry is that most teams are put together with people who are working together for the first time. And with that, I would tell you, what we find in the industry is the understanding of best practices and the way things get done, it's uneven at best. Even if people come from very sophisticated organizations and some small component of the project team has worked together before, they rarely understand the full scope and scale, the breadth of the project, and how to work together and communicate well together. The next piece that really has a tendency to undo this is, over time, as we showed in the D4 organization, your organization always changes. So one of the lessons learned that we had from this project was to develop some tests for testing where people are and training and understanding the fundamentals. And one of our recommendations going forward is to run those tests and to train people in the utilization of the fundamentals. We're going to talk about Sadara's approach to alignment and illustrate those highlighted examples that we had earlier through 3 Sadara examples. The first one we call the Sadara Way, and that's about achieving and maintaining alignment, and that'll bring us to what we saw yesterday in some of the breakout sessions that had to do with a fishbone that occurred, or a fishtail rather, that occurred where owner and contractor alignment degraded over time during project execution. The second is the first product team, and the first product team is basically to manage the transition, the key transition between construction and operations, and that includes planning for startup as a key component of that transition. And the third is what we call beyond injury free, which includes the zero accidents techniques. So Sadara, as Joseph said, Sadara affords us an excellent view of innovation and discipline because it's performed at such a large scale. But you shouldn't think when you look at these examples that, oh, that won't really apply to my project, because as we thought carefully about these things, we're sure that it applies to projects at every scale. And it's important to see how these things are applied in order to understand how can I apply it on my project.
So when the typical project manager puts his brain around what he's got to get done, I would argue that at least 95% of the time, they'll prioritize that soft stuff down the list quite a ways. Many of them try to justify why it doesn't apply to them. So my counter force to that tendency of staying away from that soft stuff was to try to make it as intentional as possible. So we produced something we call the Sadara Way. It actually was a document, like a specification, think of it that way, that tried to turn that soft stuff into hard stuff, things that these engineers and designers and construction managers could relate to. So we had a plan for how do we make decisions? Why are we organized the way that we are? A description of roles and responsibilities. How do we recruit the right team members? How do we exit a few team members? The division of labor, that 4D organization, who's doing what and why and when. How we train our people. One of the most critical things is that new member orientation. When you're spread out over 7 years plus, you're going to have changeover, and that's, as we all know, the bane of our project teams is any kind of turnover. But with this kind of long journey, not only are you going to have turnover, you're going to find yourself managing people's career development, something that supervisors and somebody else does, all of a sudden is your job. We put that into the Sadara Way. Face-to-face meetings are still required and vital, in my opinion. Interface management's critical between all these integrated facility teams. And last but not least, and certainly not trivial, a lot of team integration and alignment workshops. I would argue we probably held more than 150 of those on Sadara, from every team through every transition. And Mark played a big role in that. EPM did as well. And it was a vital ingredient. This is just a sampling of the kinds of things we put into our organizational effectiveness plan. We got specific. We got to talk about a lot, talked about, and agreed upon the soft stuff. I haven't said it a lot here, but perhaps it's obvious. We were bringing together two very strong companies and two very strong corporate cultures where in your comfort zone of your company, you have a lot of default answers to questions and a lot of default decisions. And in a joint venture like this, all those default answers have to be put on the table, reanalyzed, and rediscussed. And so that too was part of this alignment plan. So Mark, give us some examples about team integration and alignment sessions.
Thank you, Joseph. I think we've all seen some baton handoff at a conference like this, and it's so common, so prosaic that we typically ignore it. But I wanted to use this today because transitions are actually a very interesting time for projects. If you think about feasibility to feed or feed to design, design to construction, and construction to operations, transitions make you vulnerable. So if a guy's holding the baton and he's racing around the track, he's feeling pretty secure. As soon as it comes time to hand that off, there's vulnerability there. So transitions also represent a bow wave of work, and they're less about building speed than starting over. If you think about these guys, one guy's stopping, and someone has to come up to full speed in a very, very short period of time. And that's actually when a lot of things are happening. There's a lot of work to complete and a lot of work to start, and you're not necessarily getting any more staffing in the middle to help with it. Incidentally, these are two world-class runners, and they dropped that baton, the one in this picture. So it does happen. Maybe that's Brendan Bechtel's 98%. And the goal there is, do we have a good plan in case that happens so we can recover? So most people think a handover looks like that, but Sadara, and most projects for that matter, actually look like this. And if we could have found a race that had 27 lanes with people passing batons, that might have been more accurate, and you would probably be as amazed at what we're trying to do as we sometimes are. If you think about what a transition does, it represents an opportunity. It's an opportunity to accelerate the pace of the project by having clear plans, because you're sort of starting over and you can generate that enthusiasm and momentum. You're going to morph, to use Joseph's word, morph the client from a recipient to more of a participant. And those transitions demand what we call alignment workshops. So on Sadara, specifically for the completions transition, we developed very extensive plans for alignment workshops. There were 3. The first workshop took place between the project team and the final owner, the manufacturer, the enterprise that's going to own the project and operate the plants. Those both happen to be owner organizations from Dow and Aramco. We felt that this was important because it's pretty good to get the parents to line up so they don't fight in front of the kids. And sorry to use that metaphor, but before you introduce the contractor, you want to make sure the people that are paying the bills look like they know what they're doing. So we had a workshop with the owner's team. Then we brought in the contractor. At that time, the contractor presented their plans on how they're going to turn things over, how they track changes, how they track punch list items and things of that nature, what the documentation would look like, where to put the documentation so it doesn't end up in a wheelbarrow. The third meeting was to do a dry run, a tabletop as it were, where all parties sat around a table and passed paper and said, and then it will look like this for this system, and at least go through it the first time. Who signs what, who gives what to whom. Lessons learned from this. We found that those teams that quickly wanted to do the workshop or kind of said, we've already got it done, those were the ones that got led in a bigger circle and just returned right back to where they were. So we developed some tests, some checklists, and the 12 questions that we ask to say, are you ready and did you understand what you need to do? The second example I have for you is something we called the first product team. The first product team was driven by the complexity and size of Sadara and the fact that it's a highly integrated petrochemical complex. We had very little room to work between one unit and another and have things not work. This was not cheap. We had somewhere between 10, actually peaked at about 15 people from cross disciplines who understood things like process engineering, construction, scheduling, and things of that nature, where they could take and look across the program and always be driving every day for what the critical path was. The goal there was to have everybody know where they were on the critical path every day and have a sense of urgency about it. Here's where they really helped. They also had a tendency to drive those 25 engineering offices that were back offices to have the same sense of urgency they had on the job site, because they knew that they could end up on the critical path on any day. So this team was about aggressively managing the critical path. You see the 5 bullets of what they were responsible for. I want to say something about the third bullet, define tactical workarounds which simplify. What do I mean when I write that there? An example of that might be, as the first product team is going through what's actually necessary to operate the plant, they encountered that oxygen production or nitrogen production would not be ready in time, and that they would not be able to bring the whole plant up in order to provide that. So what did they do? They devised a workaround where they said, we're going to use bottled gas, and that means we have to get everything in place in order to do that, the procedures, hazardous materials, and all these things that they could look at and say, we're ready. We can operate using that temporary solution. One of the things we learned about the first product team is you should assign individuals who are responsible to aggressively manage your critical path and get upper management attention. We took this team on about a year after authorization, and we feel like maybe that was a little bit too late. We could have started a little earlier. The third example I'd like to give you, we call it beyond injury free. So we have heard a lot about safety during this meeting, safety statistics, improving safety. But even considering this peak Sadara was going to have of 60,000 people, and even considering if we could achieve CII's records for safety performance, that was going to yield unacceptable outcomes for Sadara. Too many injuries, too many deaths. So we didn't want to just work hard and hope for a good result. We didn't want to just do the fundamentals. We knew that we had to develop something that was unique for Sadara, and that led us to beyond injury free. So the thing about this is we first committed to the idea, and then we innovated and started to develop the practices to make it better. So we know that beyond injury free changed lives for us, changed lives in the region, and it achieved a new high watermark in terms of safety performance in the industry. Some perspective is necessary here, and I'd like to share it with you. We heard about a TRIR, a total recordable incident rate, of 3.6. That's the 2014 number we saw yesterday for the industry. And CII member companies last year achieved about a 0.38. Sadara is a 0.033. You can see that's CII is almost 12 times higher than Sadara. And the industry is almost 100 times higher. That's not a typo. 470 million man-hours. So you got to ask yourself, how do we do that? It was do the fundamentals very well, and also recognize that safety is just one component of excellent project performance. That while we treated safety as something very important, we integrated it in the total project job delivery and worked at the working level to make sure that was well known by those workers. Now, I do want to say that Sadara actually had 2 fatalities on it. So you might say, how can you say it was a success when you had something like that? Those were our colleagues. They came to do our business, and they gave their lives in the doing of that business. So I don't want to gloss that over and just make that an inconvenient fact of our project delivery. But the fact of the matter is that we were able to save other lives through the Beyond Injury Free program. As you can see, even if we performed at the CII level, putting some things into perspective, it is more dangerous from a fatality standpoint to be a lawyer in an American office than it is to be a construction worker on the Sadara job site. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, you have a higher chance of dying as a lawyer in an office. So let me move to our summary of that. Our objective here is to see these numbers beaten. It's not to come up here and say how great we are. We're duly proud of our accomplishment. But we feel that the industry as a whole can do this. And if we do the fundamentals well and keep our eye on the ball, we should do it. Thank you.
I've known Craig Martin for quite a long time in my career. I certainly appreciated his talk yesterday about safety and risk, and I love the way he ended his presentation with some questions for us hanging in the room. By no means are we trying to answer those questions today. Those are great questions, questions we need to continue to struggle with and work on. But I will, and I want to talk about how we took the fundamentals, rigorously implemented them, but we innovated on top of that. And this is a little bit about that innovation. We called it the power of and. You know, you've heard and I've said, and maybe you've said in your career, cost, schedule, quality, pick any two. But that was yesterday. It's certainly not today. In the business environment I work in, you work in, we're expected to all perform, as an industry, by the way, it's a bit of a juxtaposition, to perform in the top quartile of every metric that's critical to our business. That includes safety, but it includes productivity, it includes cost, it includes quality, schedule. And if you're going to scale it up to giga size, I can name you 10 more things that you have to perform in the top quartile in. Export credit agency financing, and they all have their different scorecards. Largest export loan by the U.S. Export Bank ever to Sadara. Local employment, local content. There are a lot of things that our teams were expected and we were expected to perform on. And so I'm going to probably offend a couple of people in the room, maybe more than a few, if I say it this way. When you take safety and you separate it from the work and you say it's got to be our first priority, what you're really, turn that coin over, what you're really admitting is all that other work, it's okay to have defects in. It's okay for unplanned events to occur, but not on safety. What I'm going to talk to you about on the power of and is how confusing that is to your workers. So how do we do this? How do we merge these together? How do we get schedule, productivity, quality, safety? How do we hit on all pistons every day and get our organizations and our teams so well aligned, so well integrated, so on top of their game that they hit the expectations that are ever present in our industry? Well, we call it the power of and I'm going to try to simplify this as quickly as I can. I believe, and we brainstormed a long time before we came to this conclusion, it has to do with being able to describe what goodness looks like to every worker every day at that toolbox meeting, where you cover, this is what we're going to do, this is how we're going to do it, this is the tool we're going to use, this is what a quality piece of work looks like, this is how you're going to keep you and your buddy safe, this is the things to watch out for. What I have found, at least in the workforce that I have worked with in the Middle East for the last 13 years, if you can explain what goodness looks like in a simple orientation every morning, there's a 99% chance you're going to get it. But the world that you and I live in today is a lot more complex than that. We have specialized everything. You know, when I joined the industry 40 years ago, I could count them, there were like 6 or 7 engineering disciplines. You know, there was civil, mechanical, electrical, controls, vessels. You go to any discipline today, and they've broken themselves up into greater specialization. Why? Because the technology, the drive for productivity, the level of expertise required, the depth of knowledge drives us to specialization. And that infiltrates everything that we do. It infiltrates the specs that we produce. It infiltrates our construction sites. And so what do we typically do? Oh, we have a new piece of software. Bring that software expert. Let him give a training course. Oh, we're going to start, let's say, we're starting elevated work. Let's bring in the elevated work training module. You know, that's appropriate. But in reality, what we do is we send in what I call the zealots. We send in the subject matter experts, which is good. They're very knowledgeable. They have a deep knowledge, and they can explain their subject quite well. But we don't put a filter between those zealots and those subject matter experts and the worker and what we're doing by default, not even knowing we're doing it, we're expecting that worker to integrate it all. And I think that's one of our loose shoestrings. I think that's where we trip up. So in Sadara, we intentionally kept our zealots in check. They had a role to play. They had to be called in at the right time. Yes. But we worked with those supervisors and foremen relentlessly. Training, coaching, mentoring. Didn't matter what logo they wore. And all we asked them to do was please explain to each worker what goodness looked like that day. What was your expectation? We want to overemphasize, Mark and I do, that you cannot avoid the best practices of CII. I consider them at this scale or at your scale to be minimum requirements in today's industry. You have to implement those rigorously, thoroughly, and well. You have to monitor yourself. You have to hold yourself accountable. You have to drive it. And you have to innovate on top of that. But the power of and is that you become so good, you can describe to that worker that day how all of those knowledge areas apply to them and what they do that day. And if you can do that, they can do that. And I think that's a big part of how we were able to achieve what we did, not only in safety, but in quality, in schedule, productivity, et cetera. Now, we didn't bat 1,000. We're certainly not the perfect project. But I think we are beginning to learn how do you allow us to begin to continue that journey that we've been on my 40 years of removing unplanned events. I attended yesterday, I'll finish with this comment, an excellent session on high impact risks that we have in our workforce, those that often or can result in fatalities. And I thought to myself, you could change these same questions to high impact quality events, high impact schedule events, high impact cost events, and it all applies. It's all the same. And that's the power of integrating this and the workers that we have, whether it's a designer that comes to the office that morning and needs to get piping design done, or the buyer who's got to get those bids on the street. I challenge you. It's certainly not true of me. Am I able to be so familiar with all those best practices that I can easily translate that into what my team member needs to do that day? We're so specialized, we even call upon ourselves in little buckets and isolated niches of technology and know-how. Well, somebody somewhere along the way has got to integrate them. And my proposition to you is leaving it to that last worker in the field is not a good idea. That's the burden we must carry as leaders. So, key takeaways from today. Alignment absolutely is the most powerful tool in your toolbox. You can achieve great things. You've got to implement these best practices as though that's what gives you the right to enter into the next project. You can't allow your teams or yourself to dismiss any of them. They are absolutely required. The soft stuff really is hard, and if there's anything I want to leave you on that is that your plan for alignment has to be, must be intentional.
And I just have two things to add, the last two bullets. You should be looking for opportunities to innovate, but to be clear, you have to do the fundamentals well. So don't head out looking to change the game until you know how to play the game well. And those opportunities to innovate are not blue sky things. They are ways to creatively address the specific challenges of your project. And the last but not least, the power of and. As Joseph said, that's very easy for us to keep as a phrase. It's hard to do, and I invite you to go try. So right now, if we have time, I'd like to open it up for questions. Okay. Always move out of it.
Got a question coming.
Hi, I'm Lamont John from General Services Administration. And I'm sorry to focus on this one aspect. You talked about the comments from Mr. Bechtel yesterday and how it's kind of a standard thing on mega projects, giga projects to be 80 to 100% over budget by the end of the project. And congratulations on breaking that mold on your project. I work in an organization, our capital projects are usually between 100 to $400 million. And we strive to keep our costs within 10% overage. And if 20% happened, we would consider it a major failure. And I was wondering if you could comment on why that is maybe an accepted fact in the mega project and what happens to cause that.
I think you should.
Well, accepted, that's a great word. I don't think anybody going into a mega or giga project has an expectation they're going to have that kind of performance. I think one of the things I think that we did well is that when I say we, Saudi Aramco's great talent pool as well as Dow's, when we walked into this challenge, it was so large, it stunned us, it took our breath away. And perhaps because of that, we recognized that at this scale, boy, things can really go wrong. And my description of that is when you go giga, a lot of things go non-linear on you. And I could spend a lot of time, I could spend an hour talking about what those are and why they go non-linear. But what people most often do in our industry, you've done it, we've done it, I've done it, is we take our last experience, we take our career's experience, and we do linear extrapolations of that to take on the next challenge. We don't do that intentionally, we do that in our gut. And yet, what we don't see coming at us is some of these non-linearities. I'll give you a very, very simple example. When you're this big, you have a critical path. Maybe you have a couple that are near critical paths, but you have an awful lot of stuff that's off critical path. Now, the typical approach to this giga project or a mega project is to take the components, define the scope, estimate the cost and schedule, roll it up, and you're there. Well, what I just did was completely ignore a phenomenon with something that's really big that most people don't see when they extrapolate their past experience. They don't see that you've got an enormous amount of mass. When I say mass, I'm not just talking about pipes and steel and wire and concrete. I'm talking about teams that are off critical path that in a normal setting wouldn't be off critical path. And just to recognize that, put a cost estimate around it, understand how it works with your schedule. Again, when you scale up, we tend to do linear extrapolations, but mega and giga, especially giga, goes non-linear on you, and that's what catches people by surprise.
I would just like to add very briefly to that, one of the things you discover on these very large jobs is the integration load, the communication among those various things is nonlinear. And you should expect that as jobs get larger and more complicated, that it's very difficult to anticipate that integration load and anticipate the size of the owner team that's necessary to manage moving that information.
Example of what Mark just said was interface management. My last project was in Kuwait, a mega project, 5 world scale, first evers. Interface management, I could draw it on a drawing, I could imagine it, now I've got 26. That's nonlinear. That's not just 26 times a certain amount of full-time equivalent people to do interface management. It requires a whole lot more. So I think that's tapping into it. Let me also say and amplify this message especially well. If you think good PDRI scores are important for your $100 million project, just imagine how important it is when you got $20 billion on the line. Any flaw in your feed work is going to get amplified more than you ever expected. And again, people take their past experience, they linearly extrapolate it, and they dismiss, oh, that small, I know that's a problem on that utility PNID, but we'll fix it in design. Bad decision. Great question.
We have another.
Question? Thanks. Zofia Kuski, Texas A&M University. Thank you very much for your presentation. Question, we do research right now on alignment and integrated project delivery. And of course, one of the things that interests me is that it requires all the parties to optimize a system over their own personal gain at times. So the tendency towards sub-optimization, of course, is part of what makes alignment difficult. My question is, what kind of contracts did you put in place that would reward those who were thinking more for the benefit of the team, so that those, because there's always that tendency to be vulnerable if you use a traditional contract and it requires some kind of legal support.
Yeah.
Well, the short answer is there really were none. So there was a social contract, and one of the things that we noticed is when it's about establishing trust, and so you have to do that again and again and again. Now, what we've also found is what leads to a lot of people pulling in different directions is they use the same word and mean completely different things with it. Is that complete? And one person's vision of complete is this, and another's vision is that. So the integration workshops are about getting together and getting that out in front of them. You never actually really cure this problem that you're talking about, and in fact, contracts may help, but they have a tendency to make people more contractual. So Joseph, as a leader, was very, very careful about using the terms alignment and consensus, and having a social contract and driving people to that and saying, that's not acceptable. Full discussion in the room, full argument in the room, full alignment coming out of the room. And so it's leadership from the top, it's setting this cultural norm, this standard, and holding people to it through social justice sorts of programs within the organization that, hey, you won't get promoted, or you won't get to do that, or you're not going to get asked to do that again, or I'm going to pull you aside and give you a good firm talking to from quite a senior leader to say, that's not okay. Did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I'll add that that tendency of people to sub-optimize on their part of the work is a human tendency. We certainly see it amongst all of the contractors that we had. And we had basically two strategies for countering that. One was we intentionally did not make contracts interdependent. We didn't allow one of our contracts to point to another and say, when this piece of work gets done, then you can do this. Setting up all those interdependencies would have been a mess. We kept them all independent. You do your piece of work, you finish your work, you're done. Let's see, I had another one, but I can't remember right now. It had to do with the people. Oh, I know what it was. It was everywhere we knew that we had those vulnerabilities, we basically put in a functional team to facilitate. You can interpret the word audit a bit, and encourage, and report back. How are we doing? You know, interface management happens to be one of those places where you're pretty vulnerable to that, because the human tendency is, if my piece of pipe gets there first, I'm the king of the hill. And I don't have to talk to that other guy who's got to connect to it. Well, that's not true. And we facilitated quite a few sessions, probably hundreds, around the interface management, where you're very vulnerable. But that's block and tackle is how we did it, is the short answer. Keep the contractors independent as much as you can. Let them work on their piece of scope as well as they can, as empowered as they can, and where they needed to work together in a coordinated fashion, you put the owner there and they facilitate.
Thank you very much. I think we're finished here.